let me get into what I want to talk about with emotion, because this is probably not touched on very much, and a few of you guys in these past chats have mentioned about my book, and one of the chapters that I put in there, and I really wanted that to be in there, was the part about emotion and the emotional beat and getting the emotion. And I'm not exactly sure uh, if that came across so clearly, because I want everybody to understand that when you're doing visual storytelling, it's not just about the image. It's great to have good composition and to have everything beautiful, depth, and really interesting camera angles and that stuff. But really, what's behind all that, it's going to help you get to the emotional beat of that particular moment. So that's what's really important. That's what it is when you're doing your visual storytelling. It's about the emotional beat and getting that right. So I don't hear that many people talk about that when it comes to visuals, because I think there's a little bit of a divide when it comes to like the writers and the written word, and then you have the visual artists and the visual side. And it seems like the visual guys are just worried about the image and making something pretty. And really what you have to do is that image serves a purpose and it's serving the story. And you have to build up the story through emotion. That is the basis of everything that we should be doing. And the reason why, and I bring this back, is because if you have awesome, pretty images and really cool special effects, no one is going to care if you don't hook them with really strong characters and really strong situations, because that is what's going to get them to stay and watch that whole film and really get engaged. And just think about your favorite movies and what ones really stick in your mind, and the ones you remember and the scenes that you remember. I would almost guarantee it has to do with the personal connection, with the emotion at that moment, with all of the climax and the buildup with those characters, more than an actual effects shot or a dinosaur eating somebody in an effects movie or something like that. It's really about the people and the story behind all of that. And I think that's one thing that studios like Pixar do so well. Disney's been killing it recently in the recent years with their films. I think they came out really, really strong. So that's cool to see that there's this really nice trend to get back to the core of what it is in a story. All right. Just a reminder, if you guys have any questions, go ahead and type those in, shout those out, whatever you got to do, because I want to answer your questions about visual storytelling and get that going. Maybe, and kid, this is all over the board. So if you're working on a project, maybe you have some suggestions for people, maybe you have some resources for people. That would be really helpful. Maybe you have some blockers, like we talked about last time, people getting stuck in a rut with storytelling in your career and all that. And that's very real, and it's something we should be talking about. And so if you guys have any tips and tricks for that, or anything else under the sun, I'm fair game for that. A couple of things on my mind this week are just staying productive. So I've been working a lot, trying to organize my time so that I can make headway on some of the projects that I have. So right now I'm working on a live action short film, trying to finish that up, and also doing development work on a live action feature. So both of those things are kind of taking up dual time. And of course, there's family and there's personal obligations and all that stuff going on too. So it's a little bit of a juggling effect here with, especially being at home and not being as active outside. It's really just focusing down on studio work and seeing if you can take advantage of that. So that's all good. All right, cool. Let me jump in there and say hi to everybody. Awesome. I'm so glad you guys could join. This is great. Hey, all right, Animation Diva, you got a question here. Let me answer that. So do you have a rhythm, wide shot, close up, etc.? I think what you're referring to is just like kind of like a filmmaking style and the way that you attack a scene. And because what I interpret from rhythm, and this is what I like to think about, is like it's the build up, and I'll equate to the visuals, right? It's the visual build up of the pacing and the rhythm within your sequence. And this could be like starting out with wide shots and then coming in ever so closer to the subject or to the characters involved, and then staying really tight. That's one thing that I like to do, is it's pretty standard, right? You start out wide and you come in close, but then you stay close. Don't pull out wide again, right? So that's one thing I do. And then the rhythm as well, you can also do this with composition. So let's say everything is very, very static, very horizontal and vertical, very uniform and symmetrical. And then all of a sudden, as things start to heat up in your sequence, right? And it's heating up emotionally, let's say, right? So the emotion of the characters are getting bigger and stronger. Maybe they're getting more angry and that kind of thing. Then you start doing things that will represent that visually. So you start tilting the camera lens ever so slightly, right? And you do that with every single shot, and you build that up, and then you create that as a rhythm, right? Another one that you could do is your cutting rhythm. This is the pacing of your shots. So you start out with a long wide shot. You hold that for maybe 20 seconds, which actually is a considerable amount of time. And then suddenly the shots start getting shorter and shorter and shorter. So classic example of this is The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, another great Sergio Leone, great Italian director. And the last kind of Mexican standoff scene is really famous. It's got the music score and the Morricone famous music score there, and it builds that up, and then suddenly the pacing starts getting tighter and tighter. The shots start getting tighter and tighter. It's getting quicker and quicker, and then all of a sudden, boom! What happens? The climax, and then the gunfight ensues. So that's one thing that you can do. Now, do I have one in particular? Like, is there a style I can call my own? Not really. I like to adapt that for every particular sequence. So I do a ton of research when I start a project or a sequence, and I'll pick the things that I like, and I'll kind of formulate an idea of how I want to attack it. So, and you could do, this is where it gets fun. You could do things like, oh, I'm going to make this more Spielberg-like. Oh, I'm going to make this more, Orson Welles-like. And you build that up, and you choose a style, and then for that particular scene, you do that. And action scenes lend themselves really easily to this, because you could do things like, I want to do quick cuts in this action scene, or you could do wide shots that have a lot of action, and maybe the camera's following the action, and it's big long takes, right? So you can do that too. It's like Children of Men, if you've seen that movie, with like a lot of takes, and the action is still really, really strong. So there's different styles there too. So hopefully I kind of answered that question, and touched on a little bit about that. Awesome, great to see you guys. Hey Tad, what's happening? Good to see everybody. Again, I'm taking questions, so if you guys want to throw those my way, I'd love to give you my take on a couple of things. So the other thing I wanted to mention is, and I say this often, but I don't think you can ever say this enough, is that there's this skill and drawing ability that you have to build up in order to be able to put that aside in a sense, and use that as a tool. After a while, you don't have to think so much about the drawing. What you're thinking about is the storytelling. But don't forget that tool of drawing and perspective, illustration, composition, anatomy, proportion, all of those art skills are what is going to get you to the point that you're working at a high level, and you're actually creating storytelling and talking about the emotion and doing these things, right? So I use a lot of analogies, but think of it like, one of them is like when you're first learning to drive, right? If you remember that, it's like you got two hands on your wheel, you get the radio off, you're looking at all the mirrors, right? You're concentrated. Every single thing is just focused on what you have to do, because you're not familiar. You need more practice in the gears and all that stuff when you're moving a vehicle, right? But then now, let's say you know how to drive. When's the last time you actually thought about how you're moving that car? Really what you're focused on, you got the conversation, you got your radio full blast, you got your podcast, whatever it is that you're doing. You're not even worried about the mechanics of driving. That's kind of the level you want to get to with your drawing. You want to get so familiar with the actual drawing process that it just becomes a tool, and you're using it to excel, right? So think of that as like a race car driver. A race car driver is like the ultimate, because their driving skills are so good. What they're focusing on now is just getting faster and faster and faster, right? So and winning a race. Same thing with like the analogy of like an ice hockey player. They're not worried about skating and ice skating. Like, they're worried about playing hockey. So it's like you get so good at ice skating that it's almost like a non-issue, and then you're focused on the game, right? Kind of the same thing with drawing. Now, not to say that drawing is a secondary thing. I really enjoy the process, and it's communication of an idea, and that you're using your drawing skills to do that, right? So I always say communication, not illustration, right? Illustration makes things pretty. Illustrating, can sometimes be conceived as something decorative. It could also be storytelling too, but communication is, to me, the number one thing. So you could have chicken scratch, you could, it could be really messy, but if you communicate that idea in your image with the tools that you're using, and you communicate it well so everybody else understands that universal idea that you put in there, you've done your job. Okay, so you don't have to be like a masterful draftsman every single time. Now, it certainly helps. That's why I recommend you guys study and work and keep up your drawing and do it as much as you can, right? Because you get easier, it gets easier, and you get faster at it, right? So talking about that, a couple questions came up, which was one, how do you actually get to drawing a simplified style and you have a unique way of doing your storyboards and your visual storytelling? Because it's not that easy if you just start, and because what you might end up doing is you start going into details and start rendering things, and you tend into the illustration part, which I talked about earlier, where it becomes more graphic and you're worried about the actual image and the rendering of the image, and not necessarily about the communication of the idea. And so how do you actually do that? One way to do it is to think of simplifying and creating a shortcut, a drawing shortcut, and these are like shorthand method of working that you use, and these are simplifying common shapes and people that you're drawing in your compositions. So instead of doing like a fully rendered anatomical drawing each time you put a character in your scene, or like worrying about every detail of their clothing and their costume, if they're like a warrior or some kind of guy who's got a sword and you're worried about all the detail on the sword, it's really about just simplifying that to create a nice strong silhouette, a really good solid pose. And then what you should be doing is composing that into the frame, so that really what stands strong is the visual statement, not so much the details that you're putting in there. A couple of stories came to mind when I was thinking about this question that came up. I remember I took a class from Rob Gibbs, who's a well-known story artist and an animation director, longtime Pixar guy, and I think now he's at Disney. I remember when I was studying with him, I turned in my work, and it was like I was saying, it's like very rendered. I put like marker tones in there. I was like really trying to impress. And then I think he was just being diplomatic, but he looked at it and he was like, you should really practice simplification of these characters. And I didn't understand what he meant by that. I was like, huh? Like, I thought I was doing a good job by, really trying to polish my boards and do everything I could with those images. But what he was trying to get at is that the speed of production and what you have to do to produce a nice communication of ideas requires that you simplify your drawings, and you get the basics down, really, which is the camera angle, interesting composition, really strong pose, but you don't overdo it and over render it. And then I remember when I was actually started working on the production, and one of the first times I got to work on elaborating a sequence in a feature film, I sat down with the story supervisor, and I kind of did the same thing. I was rendering stuff out, and he's like, look, man, you're just doing thumbnails. This looks like it could be a finished oil painting. What you got to do is simplify this stuff. Get rid of all your tone, get rid of all your shading, and just do an outline and simplify things. So he really forced me to simplify my characters and just do like silhouettes and shapes. And he explained it to me in a way that I understood a little bit better, was that I could now, the reason you do that is you get your ideas across. It has nothing to do with rendering your shapes or your composition. You get the ideas across first, and then there's time later to polish your boards. But if the idea isn't strong, you got to throw it out and start all over. So that is really the basics. So the way you get that is just by practice, and then understanding, rationalizing that in your head, that you first start out with getting the basic idea down. And you could time yourself. So if you're spending more than like an hour and a half on one single story panel image, you might be dipping into like rendering and that kind of thing. And not that that's bad, but if the purpose is getting the sequence out and it's just like an initial pitch for somebody, don't waste time on like details and eyelashes and shading and stuff if it's not important. Get the real story beat across. You can tell a storytelling image with just an outline and line work and good solid silhouette. You don't have to put crazy color or any fancy rendering or 3D graphics or anything of that stuff. Forget it. Just keep it simple. Another thing that we did, I remember when we were working first on previs back in the Clone Wars days, we were trying to develop a style, and I agreed with some of the people out there. Some people wanted to actually add lighting and and all these effects to previs. Eventually they got there. The tools weren't developed early on that well, or like it was not easy to use at first. But I was of the argument, like I would just have this black and white, no shading, no lighting at all, because what you want to do is show the composition. And if the story doesn't work with those simple characters with flat lighting, it's not going to work no matter how much lighting you put in there. So, sometimes, people, if you had a particular use for lighting, if you're doing just like shadows and silhouettes and it's much more like film noir stuff, yeah, that can help. And we did some of that, but yeah, I'm of the camp that you simplify it. If it doesn't work in a simple format, it's not going to work no matter how many bells and whistles and shading and stuff you put on top of it. Okay, cool. Let me get to some other questions here. Awesome. Thanks again for joining us and giving us your thoughts. Okay. Forget focus. It's not easy, but this one. Let me say this is from Abigail. But forget let me see if I'm reading this right. It seems like forget a grid angle is not easy. Also, must think so hard to make storyboard before taking a shot. Yes. So let me sum up this question. It's all about the thinking process when you're going through your sequence, right? So people sometimes get caught up in making something pretty. And what you want to be focusing on is making sure that the storytelling and the communication is correct. It's right. It's telling the story properly. Forget about the bells and whistles and embellishing it and making it pretty. You can do that later if you have time. But what you want to do is think about it. And this is where it becomes really hard. I learned from a couple people about this, and it was really funny that like when it comes down to, and we've, other story guys I worked with, we share the same idea, is that even listening to music can be somewhat distracting when you have to think through a sequence. Now that might seem strange for people who haven't heard this before, but let's say you have your headphones on and you're like grooving to your music to get into your focus and stuff. But when you're conceptualizing a scene and you're trying to block out thumbnails and understanding which shots are working when, it actually helps that you eliminate all distractions. And one personal thing that I do is if I have headphones, I'll only use it to block out the rest of the noise in the studio. And what I won't put like music that gets me pepped up or like rock or something that like gets me inspired. What I'll put is like jazz, because it's just like calm, and it's not like Miles Davis jazz or like John Coltrane, which is like, has dissonant sounds and stuff in there. It's more like just the smooth, melodic kind of background noise, right? And what it does, it kind of tunes everything out, and then it also blocks out the inner noise and stuff. So yes, the music's playing, but it's not distracting me, and I could focus on the thinking process. And then in an ideal world, if there's no sound, then I just focus. And so I remember a director one time, he closed his office door when I was starting out in the studio, and then the assistant there was like, "Oh no, please don't go in there because he's working on a sequence right now and he really needs to think." And so he shut the door and he sat himself in there, and he was all in there by himself, quiet, working on the sequence. And I was thinking, wow, that's kind of cool. I should do that, because he needed that focus time to really think about this. Now I've heard the same story from other story artists too, that they can listen to music when they're cleaning up their sequence and they're polishing up their boards. But when they're first conceptualizing the sequence and actually thumbnailing something out, it actually takes a lot of concentration, and that's when they don't listen to something that would distract them, right? Now everybody's different, but try this. Now Richard Williams, who's a famous animator, has this story from Milt Kahl. If you guys know these animation gurus and masters, Milt Kahl is a really famous Nine Old Men, one of the old time masters of animation. And when Richard Williams, who was like a young artist at the time, asked Milt Kahl like what he does and if he listens to music while he's working, Milt Kahl just like, so the story goes, he turned and he yelled at him. He's like, "How can you possibly listen to music and do two things at once while you're animating a sequence and drawing it out?" It was something to that effect, and that left a huge impression on Richard Williams. So it was basically the fact that like you need absolute concentration to do what you're doing and focus. And so any kind of music or anything else would be a distraction. Now, not everybody agrees with that. But especially like I'm saying, when it comes to conceptualizing that first pass, I usually try and block things out so there's no distractions. All right. Okay, cool. Hopefully there's some other questions here. And let me say hi to some guys. Hey, Carlos. All right, Carlos Rodelli. How are you? Saludos, my friend. Good to see you. I hope everybody's doing well over there in Chile, and and I hope everybody's out there in anywhere you are is doing well and doing has some positive vibes during these crazy Corona times. So let me answer this question from Melly Illustration. What are some good films to do board studies of, and what are some good storyboarding exercises we can do when we watch them? That's an excellent question. So good films to do studies of, really you can do that on any film, even bad movies. You can so one interesting exercise is take a terrible movie that you consider terrible and figure out why. So is it the compositions, or is it the setups, and then you can improve on it and see if you can make it better, right? One assignment from Tim Burgard, who has a live action course on storyboard art, who's a really famous Hollywood storyboard artist. He had an assignment to watch Batgirl with Halle Berry, and to take a sequence there and reboard that out and how you want to. And that's a really fun sequence because and if you actually analyze that movie, the film is actually constructed visually pretty well. Like the technical part of that movie is actually pretty solid. What I think is what everybody complains about is probably the setups and the acting and the way they executed things. But the technical part of it is actually, the shots, it cuts well, there's nicely composed. So it's a little bit of a challenge to do that. Okay, so let me mention some other good films to watch. I always love the classics. So go back and watch things like Lawrence of Arabia. I love the Orson Welles movies like Citizen Kane and Touch of Evil. Those like noir films are great. I recently rewatched a bunch of westerns. So I mentioned Sergio Leone. All of his films are excellent. One for composition especially, this is a good tip, and I think it's still on Netflix, is go watch Once Upon a Time in the West. It's a miraculous film of composition. It's so beautiful. A lot of his like Western films are always well composed. I love the Coen brothers. Watch those films and freeze frame those and draw from them. So things like Miller's Crossing, even back to Raising Arizona. I just watched Blood Simple for the first time, which I hadn't seen because it's not easily distributed. Blood Simple is amazing. That's their first film. No Country for Old Men. All their films are amazing, really, really well done. Coen brothers. So, and then what exercises can you do? I just mentioned one. You can redo some of the scenes, but one of the things that's just very basic is as you're drawing these compositions, you freeze frame it, draw the composition, and analyze why you like the composition. And then one thing that you're going to find, and this is something I discovered from doing this exercise, and I should share with you some of my studies. I keep them. They're all in my sketchbook or in loose pages, but I should take a picture of them, post them to Instagram or Facebook and stuff. But I'm always amazed how the compositions that they're choosing and that final image are usually a little bit wider than I anticipate. And it's probably because it's going to be projected on a giant screen. So my first inclination would be like to go in a little bit tighter, but no, most of the time they're given a lot of room in the composition for the actors to move around. And to me, it's interesting how they're framing. So I learned a lot from studying films like that. Cool, great questions. All right, yeah, I made it just in time. Alyana, welcome, and send us your questions if you have them. All right, Jenny Art. Let's see. You recommend any book for anatomy and drawing and character design? My favorite book for anatomy and figure drawing is Figure Drawing for All It's Worth by Andrew Loomis. I think that book it's not an anatomy book, and I'll give you another recommendation for an anatomy book. But it does have parts of anatomy, and I think what it does is it shows you what you should be working on a global level when it comes to figure drawing. So I would start there with that book. It's back in print, so that's excellent, and you can find the link on Storyboard Art and some of our recommended books. And then the next one I would recommend, and this is also classic, is George Bridgman for his anatomy book. So look at the Bridgman series of books. All of them are excellent. He does these like big blocky shapes, but they're really descriptive. And if you learn to draw that with the mass and the way that the muscles and the bones and everything are constructed, you'll be right on because it teaches you proportions and stuff. After that, you can get into more detailed books. There's like Michael Hampton has he's a contemporary artist who has a anatomy book, and that's highly recommended. There's certain one from like Paul Richer, who's a anatomist back in the day. I have like 3 or 4 anatomy books, like seriously heavy duty anatomy, which is you sit down and you have to like study the origin and the insertions of all these bones and muscles. And after I kind of know my anatomy, but honestly, I haven't memorized every single bone and muscle, the insertion points and all that stuff. I kind of want to get to that level because there's some anatomists that are working out there today that I really admire, and I love the way they're doing. So Scott Eaton is one of those guys that I learned a lot from, and he's great. So anyway, check out that. So character design books. There's do I know any good character design books? I think one thing that you probably could do is just the art of books from the films that you like. So character design to me seems like you could do live action character designs, things like from the Matrix films, or like Mad Max, like Fury Road that just came out. You can look at some of those designs. But I think mostly when it comes to design work, it's like thinking of animation and 3D movies. So all of the art of books from like Pixar, Disney, DreamWorks, all of those are excellent. And I would recommend the one from Kung Fu Panda. I really like the character design artist there. And let me think of some other ones that I really like for characters. That's the first one that comes to mind. But yeah, any one of those art books, you'd be on the right track for that. All right, I'll dig up some of the ones I do have and show you that. All right, so great questions. Let me get a couple more here before we call it a day. So Icky V, let's see. I've seen storyboard drawn on realistic level of rendering. What's the point of refining that much during production? So I think what you're asking is like what kind of level of finish do you need for a storyboard? The answer to that question depends on the type of job that you're doing. So the first thing that you should do, one of the first questions that you should ask in a job is what type of storyboard you're looking for. And I've made this mistake before. I start drawing a storyboard and the guy looked at it and he's like, "What? That's it? This is what you turn in? This piece of crap chicken scratch that you're doing?" And what I didn't make clear to the client or the art director was those were my initial roughs. So they were rough sketches and they were expecting like cleaned up, finished, illustrations. And I hadn't asked them before. So now every single time when I go to a client, I ask, all right, what kind of result are you looking for? And then I'll show them examples. I'll say, okay, this one is rendered. This one is, this one's a little bit rougher. This one is like in between. So you can show them different levels. And that's your answer. So what happens is if they're looking for a really tight storyboard, and clients will do this stuff. Oh yeah, I love that one. That's beautiful. That looks like an illustration. Give me that. And I need 300 of those by tomorrow. And you're like, hey man, one of those took me 8 hours. So you can only get, so you have to explain to them what exactly is entailed in doing that kind of a finish. So I'll usually tell them, okay, you can do this. I can do, let's say 50 of these thumbnail drawings in a day, or I could do, 100, I'm saying that backwards. Let's say I could do 100 thumbnails in a day and I can only do 50, simplified storyboards with tones, but they still look good and solid. Or I could do like 5 really tight rendered concept boards. And then they have to pick, but you have to make that very clear up front. So you should be able physically to be able to do any one of those levels, right? You should be able to do something really tightly rendered with nice polished light and shadow, not going overboard, right? And you should also be able to do something really simple and with just like simple tones, blocking those out. Or you should also be able to do something quick and fast and rough, quick sketch. Some guys have trouble with doing the quick sketch stuff. I'm kind of the opposite. I've done quick sketch my whole career. So sometimes when I have to sit down and actually do a rendered thing, like I need to look at reference and pick things out because it's not as natural to me anymore. So the other thing that determines the finished level of your storyboard is your deadline. So if they want 1,000 concept boards beautifully polished, but they only have a week to do them, you got to tell them, hey, I can get 5 of these, and then the rest are going to be really rough. You just got to let them know. All right. Cool. Okay, these are great questions. Let me take some from Facebook here. So Aliana, it's more of a concept question, but I hope this is okay. In choosing style design for characters and backgrounds, what points do you prioritize or points to keep in mind? So I'm kind of visual storytelling focused. So when you talk about style and character design for backgrounds and stuff, it really depends on your story. And so this is the fun thing about being a story artist and conceptualizing something usually at the very beginning where you may or may not have designers who have worked on concept designs or visual development for the project yet. So you can suggest things and I'll do things with depending on the story. So if it's a very like energetic and dynamic story, I might choose like really sharp angles and have like, very uh, very jagged and very like aggressive angles in my composition. If it's the opposite of that, maybe I'll do rounded shapes, right? So the characters are round, the backgrounds are round, the environments that they're in are more rounded shapes. Like you can manipulate the way you draw a house, the interior, right? The kitchen can be more like old school and rounded, or you can have a really modern kitchen with very tight angles and really clean and that kind of stuff. It depends. So if you're doing something futuristic, a lot of times you might think about doing something clean. Although depends on your futuristic movie. You could also do like some post-apocalyptic stuff, like Fury Road, which probably wouldn't be that clean. It's like rough and grungy and like kind of like yeah, just post-apocalyptic. I was just trying to say. Anyway, it depends on what your project is, right? Awesome. More questions just pouring in. Let me get to this. All right. So Howler Art, the opening sequence of any Sergio Leone. Oh, that's great. This is more like a comment. So the opening sequences of any Sergio Leone movie are a lot of fun to study. I couldn't agree more. Check that stuff out. That's really, really good. And if you haven't watched these movies, it's a different pacing. These were like in the 60s and 70s, some of these westerns, and it's a different pacing. So you have to like put yourself in the mindset of watching these films. Now everything's just like so fast paced and the cutting is like crazy. But those Sergio Leone movies are beautifully composed and well paced out. And part of the composition, the reason it's so beautiful to look at and well composed is that you can hold that frame a little bit longer and keep people interested, right? So Angelo Valens Art, let me go to your question here. What's good pixel setup ratio in Photoshop for wide format? You were speaking about for wide frame composition. Yeah, that's a good technical question. The typical HD resolution ratio right now that is really common is your 16:9 aspect ratio. Now, if you guys have no idea what aspect ratios are or what I'm talking about, what I just said, go to Storyboard Art and click on the Pro Artist Guide. And you got to have an account, but you can sign up for free and click on that. That's got an explanation of what is the aspect ratios, and there's some templates that you can use there too. So if you're looking for a Photoshop template, also go there and download the template. It's just a Photoshop thing. You can change the file all you want, just a PSD format. And so the pixel resolution for that is 1920 by 1080. So 1920 pixels by 1080 pixels. That's standard 2K HD, right? So that's like your HD TV, right? You guys all probably have some, or you've seen at least an HD TV. Then they talk about 4K, right? And you got a higher resolution 4K monitor, and that's all and then now they're coming out with 8K TVs, which is like super high definition, crazy awesome. And so right now, like the next step up is 4K. So 4K is double what 2K is, which is the 1920 by 1080. So double that is like 3,800 something or other, right? So just double just double the number, and that'll get you but the aspect ratio is still the same. Okay, so it's widescreen, and that's the most common one nowadays because your cell phones are like that. Most YouTube videos are like that. Even films are like that. Now, the aspect ratio, depending on your project, will change, but I think that's the best pixel ratio to use right now because it's the most common format that people are using. You can also get wider with a 2:3:5 aspect ratio. That's really fun to compose in, and that's what some of these Sergio Leone movies and stuff. And there's stuff in between. So a lot of animated movies are done in 1:8:5 aspect ratio. So this sounds really technical, but just know that that's how wide or how square your compositions will be. So you'll be fine with 1920 by 1080. So check that out and then download some of the templates on Storyboard Art. Cool. All right, guys, awesome. All right, one more question here from Rover Dunn. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Talk about rates. It's important for the storyboard artists that are not in the USA or Canada. Yeah, let me talk a little bit about that. We talked some about some of that in our kind of previous story chats here that I did, and let me answer that. And that's probably a good question to end on. So a couple of things that you can do. One thing I mentioned is for people that are not inside the U.S. market, the easiest thing you can do, since the U.S. market is probably the biggest film market in the world, maybe it's actually the second biggest compared to like Bollywood. I think they actually produce more films. Regardless, though, the Hollywood history and the way the industry has been set up is usually still run out of LA. At least that's the one I'm most familiar with. So the rates have been pretty well established in Hollywood and LA in the United States. So the easiest thing to do is look up those rates in LA, and you can go to the local 800 union and just Google that, do a search for the Animation Guild, do a search for the local 800 Art Directors Guild, and then you can actually download the rates. They publish these rates, and it's kind of a range, but that's your starting point. Okay, so even if you're not in the U.S. market, and it's all based if you're a supervisor, if you're a journeyman, if you've had, if you're an entry level, they'll put that there too. I think it's called revisionist. So they have all these different categories. So you have to figure out which one you fit in. So if you're just starting out, you're not going to be able to charge a supervisor rate. If you get lucky and you grab a job like that, great, that's awesome. But you have to adjust your rates to what the market is. And especially in these times, let's bring this back to what's going on now. Right now things are shut down, right? You might have people who are not contracting freelancers as much anymore. Productions might put things on hold, or they're scrambling to finish it up because personnel has just been like dispersed. They're at home. They can't be in the studio for obvious reasons. So you have to be able to be flexible with your rates. That's one thing you should understand, that your rate is not set in stone. It's something negotiable. So when it comes to signing up onto a production, one of the things that I like to do is, I have my established rate that's in the back of my mind. I know that what I want to charge, but then I'll ask the production, I'll say, what kind of budget do you guys have? What are you looking to pay for this position? I'll put that out there and let them give me the answer. If they say, well, we'd like to hear from you first, and you can say, well, and then if you want to, you can give them a number. You could also kick it back to them and say, well, my rate fluctuates based on the demand for the particular projects I'm working on. And but if I'm really into your project, I might be able to give you a break because I like to work on things that are creatively inspiring for me or that will push me artistically. You could say things like that, which is, oftentimes is very true. So then your rate can adjust, and you work out a deal so you have a win-win situation. They're happy, they're getting your services, and you're also happy because you're getting a rate that is that you've agreed on and that you're willing to take. Okay, so I don't recommend pushing super hard every single time. Trying to get your maximum out. You could say something like, "Yeah, I want to get $1,000 an hour." And what will end up happening is that if they don't want, if that's too much for that particular production, you're not going to get the job. So one thing to do is keep in mind those rates, and it ranges. Let me give you numbers now. Let's talk about numbers. It ranges anywhere from, let's say, $250 per day to up to like, 600, 800 to like the real veteran artists. Guys who have been around a long time and they're really in demand. They might be supervisors and things like that. You might be charging even more than that. And it's usually a day rate that you want to charge. And especially if you're outside of the US market, understand that that's what the going rate is in the US productions. So if you're in Europe, you might be able to adjust that rate because your cost of living is less than being in LA. LA is a very expensive city to live in. And so you have to charge a lot of money to be able to survive and actually make ends meet. So if you're in a market that has a cheaper cost of living, you can afford to be more competitive and hopefully get that job. And then what happens is you build up that network and you start connecting with people. So it's not always about the money. It's really about you getting more experience, doing the work that you want to be doing, and growing as an artist. Those are valuable things too. So let's say you're willing to take less on your rate, but what you're getting in return from experience, from working with new contacts that you're going to carry around and meeting new friends, that's really valuable, and that actually compensates you just as much as the money part. Now, also, I want to say I recommend that you guys cover your bases. So especially this goes for times like now, where, like I said, people could be out of work. They're going to get broke because they have nobody who's giving them a call. So what you have to do is at least know what your economic, minimum is, and then be able to charge a little bit more so you can save on top of that. But then there's really a hustle factor there so that you can really move, get the jobs that you want, and actually, survive, be able to eat and feed your family and grow as an artist. So there's a lot of flexibility there with your rate. It's not really set in stone. Yeah, so keep that in mind. The other thing, now that we're on this tip about money and economics, make sure that your monthly burn, this is the amount of money that you're spending on everything, rent, food, software, any kind of thing that you have a monthly bills for, credit cards, whatever it is that you have to spend money on, that it's as low as possible. That should just be like a guarantee around the board. Don't just spending your money, because this type of industry fluctuates a lot. So you could have really good years, and you can have a couple lean years, and that even goes if you're working at the studios. They might cut the project, and so you're out of work. And in times like now, where like all of a sudden this crazy virus comes up, you can't go applying for studios anymore. What are you going to do? You have to have savings. So make sure you're very smart about your money, and that you're not just blowing it on video games and iPhones, that you actually save some of that for a rainy day. And I have a friend who I really like what he said. He's like, you got to have a fuck you fund, which is a little bit of money stashed away so that when you really need to exit a project, it's just an analogy, pardon my French, but it's just an analogy to have that money stashed away so that it's like it's a security blanket, so you can exit a job if you need to and move on to something else. You're not going to be going hungry for that particular month. All right. So with that little advice, I think that's probably a good place to end it. Thank you guys for your questions, and we'll do some more of these. So yeah, stay tuned for more chats as they come up. All right, friends, stay busy, stay healthy, and stay strong out there, and we'll talk soon. Okay, see ya.